Welcome to Keith Knight Don't Tread on Anyone in the Libertarian Institute. This is an article from antiwar.com, Individualism vs. War, by Scott Horton. War is ultimately about collectivism. During crisis, individuality fades in favor of team effort. During violent conflict, particularly between governments, the world becomes, especially it seems for Americans, a giant bloody football game. Our team versus theirs, us versus them, good versus evil, go team go. This, of course, leads to all sorts of fallacious thinking, such as, death to them is not like death to us. We have to let them bomb us. They won't know we've broken the codes. Using nuclear bombs on civilians saves lives. Everything changed on September 11th. And don't you understand that we are at war? The last two are usually intended as a blanket permission slip for the state to break any law, tell any lie, and kill any person so long as it is to protect us from them. In George Orwell's nightmarish dystopia, 1984, the world is divided into three empires in a state of perpetual warfare because, quote, the consciousness of being at war and therefore in danger makes the handing over of all power to a small caste seem the natural, unavoidable condition of survival. Every so often, a bomb falls in on a lower-class neighborhood and kills enough people to remind them that they are at war and need Big Brother to protect them. Chris Hedges, author of What Every Person Should Know About War, describes patriotism in his book as merely a thinly veiled form of collective self-worship. As Randolph Bourne said in 1918, war is the health of the state. The moment war is declared, the mass of people, through some spiritual alchemy, become convinced that they have willed and executed the deed themselves. They then, with the exception of a few malcontents, proceed to allow themselves to be regimented, coerced, deranged in all the environments of their lives, and turned into a solid manufactory of destruction toward whatever other people may have, in the appointed scheme of things, come within the range of the government's disapprobation. The citizen throws off his contempt and indifference to government, identifies himself with its purposes, revives all his military memories and symbols, and the state once more walks in august presence through the imaginations of men. Patriotism becomes the dominant feeling and produces immediately that intense and hopeless confusion between the relations which the individual bears and should bear toward the society of which he is part. The patriot loses all sense of the distinction between state, nation, and government. The few malcontents during America's wars have always provoked the wrath of the state, from John Adams's Alien and Sedition Acts to Lincoln's filling of military prisons with journalists and other dissenters, to the terrible Wilsonian purges of Bourne's day, through the Cold War's presidents COINTELPRO and recent intimidation of anti-war protesters. The good of the whole has always outweighed the rights of the individual from the state's point of view. Hedges says that war is a narcotic, in fact, a more powerful addiction than any drug. Our government is hooked on it, and it's destroying our country. For example, so-called representatives in Congress just made the supposedly temporary parts of the unconstitutional Patriot Act permanent. Other negative components and long-lasting side effects of war collectivism are racism and the corruption of language, as in the mass slaughter of the Tutsis and Hutus. These were ethnicities essentially invented by the Dutch, according to the ethnologist Luc de Huche in Rwanda in 1994. All that is necessary to convince people that it's perfectly okay to torture and murder is to repeat over and over again that the enemy, meaning of course many people, is not in fact human at all, but cockroaches, nips, gooks, krauts, Arabs, or Hajis, as the New York Times quotes an unidentified member of the U.S. Army's 337th Company, which was in charge of the interrogations of prisoners at Bagram Air Force Base in Afghanistan. where at least 2 men were murdered in custody. We were pretty much told that they were nobodies, that they were just enemy combatants, he said. I think that giving them the distinction of soldier would have changed our attitudes toward them. A lot of it was based on racism, really. We called them Hajis, and that psychology was really important. One side note, a lot of people think that the current issue is, well, in Ukraine, there's more whites, and that's why people care all of a sudden. I can promise you that a lot of the American warmongers, many of whom are also white, will proudly say that they support the mass white death in the American Revolution, the mass white death of the English Civil Wars with Oliver Cromwell, and the American Civil War with Abraham Lincoln. They also support the mass white death of the First World War, the mass white death of the Second World War, all the men who died in the Korean War, the white men who died in the Vietnam War, etc. Trust me, racism is not the big deal in this issue. But hey, they keep trying. One of these days, they're going to get it right. Article continues. It's amazing what a little dehumanization can accomplish. Perfectly nice kids turned into torturers by their government's crafty use of language. During the Bosnian War, Hedges says, war is a force that gives us meaning. Many Muslims called the Serbs Chetniks, the Serbian irregulars in World War II who slaughtered many Muslims. Muslims, for many Serbs in Bosnia, were painted as Islamic fundamentalists. The Croats, to the Serbs and Muslims, were branded as Ustash, the fascist Quisling who ruled Croatia during World War II. And there were times when, in interviews, it was hard to know if people were talking about what happened a few months ago or a few decades ago. It all emerged into one huge mythic campaign. A mythic campaign that cost 250,000 real lives. Hedges says that if you add it all up, there have only been 99 years of recorded human history where there was not a war going on somewhere, so our odds aren't that great, it's true. But the supposed usefulness of war has been shown to be false time and time again. Invasion is no way to obtain resources. It costs much less to simply pay for what is needed. The death and destruction only ensure new enemies for the future. If mankind is to have a future, it will be a future of individualism. If the politicians of the world continue to act as though their countries can only be successful at the expense of others, we are doomed. There are just too many nuclear bombs on the planet to be able to maintain perpetual war without eventual catastrophe. War is not glorious. It is not heroic. War is death. If our society is to spread the Anglo-American tradition of individual liberty, property rights, and open markets, let's start by acting out our own creed as an example to the rest and starting to treat the people of Earth and each other like we are people. Scott Horton is the editorial director of antiwar.com and the director of the Libertarian Institute. This is a quote from Human Smoke, The Beginnings of World War II, The End of Civilization by Nicholson Baker. Aldous Huxley was in Hollywood writing Ends and Means in Inquiry into the Philosophy of Nonviolence. It was 1937. The international police force that people were clamoring for was a mistake, a misnomer, Huxley believed. The police act with the maximum of precision. They go out and arrest the guilty person. He wrote, nations and groups of nations act through their armed forces, which can only act with the maximum of imprecision, killing, maiming, starving, and ruining millions of human beings, the overwhelming majority of whom have committed no crime of any sort. An international police force was in actuality a force for international massacre. If you approve of indiscriminate massacres, then you must say so, he wrote. You have no right to deceive the unwary by calling your massacre force by the same name as the force which controls traffic and arrests burglars. Here is a conversation between Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger.